My entire career in psychiatry has been in college mental health. So all my work has been with college students, graduate students, young adults. And it really has been my experience is that folks who went through a lot of bullying or teasing when they were in middle school or early high school, that it really is a pretty profound trauma that really impacts how they trust other people and create relationships as adults. It's really, it really has a terrible impact on.
Hello, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. This is Nishant and welcome to the Nishant Garg Show. The mission of this show is to help you live mindful days, and my job on this show is to invite the world-class experts to extract the practices, routines, and habits to help you live a fulfilled and abundant life. Today's guest is Holly Rogers. Holly is the co-founder of the Center for Koru Mindfulness, an agency dedicated to developing and delivering mindfulness programs for young adults. She worked as a psychiatrist at the Student Counseling Center at Duke University for 23 years, where she helped college students integrate the practice of mindfulness into their lives in a meaningful way. She is the co-author of the book Mindfulness for the Next Generation, helping emerging adults manage stress and lead healthier lives. Her latest book, The Mindful 20-something, is a guide for young adults who wish to learn about using mindfulness and meditation to enhance their journey through emerging adulthood. Without further ado, please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Holly. Holly, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I was thinking that we are recording this podcast in the morning, so I wanted to ask you, what did you have in the breakfast?
Oh, that's a funny question. So I did not have my usual breakfast because my husband is a baker as a hobby, and he made an apple pie yesterday. So I had apple pie for breakfast.
Apple pie for breakfast. What do you usually eat in the breakfast?
I usually eat oatmeal or eggs, but today I had apple pie because I love apple pie. And it seems like a good breakfast to me. It has apples in it, and I put some cream on it. It's really delicious.
So if I have to ask you, what's your creative oatmeal recipe look like?
It's not very creative. It is, I grew up in rural Oklahoma, and my grandma lived next door to us, and I ate many of my meals at grandma's house, and she just made plain old oatmeal for breakfast, and I still eat it like grandma did. I use steel cut oats now, but I don't put anything fancy in it. It's just oatmeal with a little bit of butter and a little bit of cream.
What was your childhood like?
Well, really very kind of idyllic in ways. I grew up in a rural community in Oklahoma. We lived on an 80-acre farm that was a wheat farm, but it was farmed. We leased out the farm. Both my parents were physicians. And I went to the same school, a small country school, from first grade through 12th grade, and spent tons of time running around outside, riding horses. Had a very simple childhood. Really so different from the way kids grow up today, with spending so much time on technology and being challenged by social media. Yeah. And I feel really formed by that childhood. I feel really like it's really meaningful to me that I grew up in rural Oklahoma. And I joke about that and talk about that a lot. But it really kind of allowed my childhood to be just really sort of free and unencumbered.
What would your family describe what you do for a living, Holly?
So I'm a psychiatrist. So like my parents, I'm a physician. They were not in psychiatry, though, but they certainly know what psychiatry is. So they would probably describe that. And then they also know that I'm a mindfulness practitioner and teacher, and that I have this organization that trains folks to teach mindfulness to college students. So they would be able to explain that. But I think the thing that's most clear to them is the fact that I'm a psychiatrist, and that's probably what they would say. They're not quite as sure about this whole mindfulness organization I got going on.
Could you give us a basic difference between physician and psychiatrist for business?
I think the difference people are often confused about is the difference between psychiatrist and psychologist. So I am a physician. I went to medical school. I did 4 years of residency, and my medical specialty is psychiatry. Psychologists do not go to medical school, so they don't have any medical training. They don't prescribe medicines. And people are often confused about the difference between that.
When should we go to a psychologist and when should we go to a psychiatrist if we have any sort of trouble in our life?
That's an interesting question, isn't it?
I just made it up.
Yeah, well, and because also, so psychologists do talk therapy, right? And psychiatrists do talk therapy, but also some of the best therapists I know are social workers. So, there are different specialists, different professional tracks to becoming a skillful talk therapist. Psychiatrists are trained in talk therapy, but we're also trained in the use of pharmacology, medication, to help with suffering. So some people need both to talk and to be treated with medicine. Other people really just need to talk. And I think often it's hard for people to know which they need. So, a good psychologist, if they are caring for you and notice that you really would benefit from medication, should then refer you to a psychiatrist.
What are some of the best therapists that you have come across?
What makes them great therapists, you mean?
Yes, you can say that.
So interesting. What does make a great therapist? So for one, they're really well trained, like very well trained. They've invested a lot of time and energy into developing their skills to a very high level. Psychotherapy is such a high level skill and an art. I think some people think it's, I'll hear people say, well, I don't need to go to therapy. I talk to my friends, or I can talk to my partner. And it's so important to have friends and family and other people we love to talk to. But talk therapy is a very specific skill. It's a very specific art. And it's not the same as having a really good conversation with a friend, even though I highly recommend really good conversations with friends. So when I think about the therapists I know who are really well trained, they both are highly skillful, and they're incredibly empathic, intuitive individuals who just really connect with their clients and really help guide them in transformative ways. And there's just some folks I know who I'm particularly impressed by their abilities.
Who are those folks?
Oh, you want me to name names?
If you don't mind.
I don't mind naming names. I'm just feeling like, what about all the people's name I don't name? Then that will...
Or if you could give some of the best qualities those therapists have.
Well, so interestingly, I do psychiatry, but I also run this organization, the Center for Koru Mindfulness, and a number of my colleagues in Koru Mindfulness are incredibly gifted therapists. So my co-founder of the Koru Center, Libby Webb, she's a social worker. She's no longer practicing therapy, but she's one of the most amazing therapists I've come across. And my other colleague in the Koru Center is actually still in practice doing therapy. Her name is Jenny Dixon Mills, also an amazing therapist. But there are really quite a few skillful therapists in our community.
What made you become a psychiatrist? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I went to medical school with absolutely no interest in psychiatry, really no awareness of what psychiatry was. My father was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, and my mother was a general practitioner. But still, growing up, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I, was in a medical family, and I think in part, maybe I went off to medical school. I wasn't exactly sure what else people did. I mean, I grew up in this farming community, so I was kind of around farmers and doctors. And I don't think I had what it took to be a farmer. So I went off to medical school, and I had such an interesting time in medical school. I went to the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School in Dallas. It's a really fabulous medical school. It's very rigorous. You work really hard. And when you're in medical school, you rotate through all the different specialties. You're expected to learn something about every specialty, and it's also your opportunity to decide which path you want to be on. And as I was rotating through the different specialties, like I started with obstetrics and gynecology, and then I went to surgery, and then I went to internal medicine. I think I did neurology after that. I can't remember the order, but the very last one I did was psychiatry, just by chance. You just get assigned to your different rotations. In every specialty I rotated through, the residents whom I was working with were so unhappy. They really were exhausted. They hated their jobs. They didn't want to be in the hospital. They just had no love for the work they were doing. And it was kind of demoralizing. You work so hard, you go without sleep. So when I got to psychiatry, my last rotation, I didn't have much knowledge about it. But my resident loved his job. And he loved his patients. He loved psychiatry. He was talking about it and teaching me about it all the time. I remember he had a vacation while I was on that rotation. I asked him what he was going to do, and he said he was going to spend the week lying on his couch reading books about psychiatry. And that it was so completely different from my experience with other specialties. It just had such a powerful impact on me. And I was just fascinated by the field, by our patients, by how we could help relieve their suffering. And yeah, at the end of that rotation, I was like, this is fun. I want to do this. And that's how I chose psychiatry. Yeah. And I've never been sorry. It is such a privilege and a gift to work as a psychiatrist. I really believe that helping people with their mental and emotional suffering has a bigger impact on quality of life than, even helping people with their physical suffering.
Going back to your medical school, so did you learn any life philosophy when you were in medical school?
I feel like I'm not sure I learned my life philosophy in medical school. When you ask me that question, what comes to mind for me is, as far as developing my real sense of how I am going to walk in this world, really happened after I finished my residency and I discovered mindfulness, both the practice of meditation, but the way of thinking about approaching your life from that perspective. And that really changed everything for me. It really transformed my life.
Did you include mindfulness in your practice, in your psychiatric practice, or in your personal practice?
Both. Yeah.
How did you get started with mindfulness in your personal practice?
So I finished my residency. I did my residency in psychiatry at Duke University. And I had always wanted to work and live in other countries. So I decided to take my first job after I completed my medical training abroad. But because I'm a psychiatrist and English is really the only language I could do psychiatry in, I was a little bit limited to English-speaking countries. And I ended up in New Zealand. I will say that New Zealand English was really not quite like American English. And
why?
For quite a while, I could not figure out what people were saying. It's not just the accent. They use different words that mean different things. And I would sit listening to my patients and be going, what are they talking about?
Not to interrupt you here, I would say that I had one guest from New Zealand, Karen, and I love New Zealand accent.
Yes, it's fabulous. And it takes a while to get to where you really understand it. And it also takes a while to get to where you understand that different words have different meanings. But I had a great time in New Zealand. I worked there for a year. I loved being part of that healthcare system that took such good care of their individuals who struggled with mental illness. It's just a beautiful system of care. And at the end of the year, it was time for me to return to the United States. And I really wasn't sure I wanted to come back. I was very happy in New Zealand, but I had accepted a fellowship program here in Durham back at Duke and then deferred it for a year. So I basically had accepted a job I needed to come back and finish. So I left New Zealand, but as I was traveling back to the United States, I was having tremendous angst and wasn't sure I was doing the right thing, didn't feel like I was following the path I wanted to be on, having a lot of anxiety. And as I was traveling back to the United States, back to North Carolina, I stopped in Colorado to visit my sister. She'd had a baby while I had been living in New Zealand, so I made that my first stop because I wanted to see my sister and my new nephew. While I was visiting her, she was living in Boulder, Colorado at the time, and there's a great bookstore in Boulder called the Tattered Cover. It was an independent bookstore. I know it's gotten bigger and become a little bit of a chain now. But I was wandering around the bookstore and I saw lying on a table a book that said Mindfulness in Plain English. The author is Hinapola Gunaratana. I picked the book up just because I didn't understand the syntax, mindfulness in plain English. I'd never seen mindfulness used in any particular context. It looked like it was already in English, so I just didn't know what is this book about. So I picked it up and I started just kind of thumbing through it. And as I was reading, I quickly became just really fascinated by what Gunaratana was saying about how our suffering is determined in large part not by the events of our lives, but by the way we approach and experience those events. And that you can learn this skill, this strategy for living your life with full presence, acceptance, interest, curiosity, compassion, and it totally will transform your life. So I was just fascinated by it. It's a very skillfully written book. I still love that book. I sat down in the Tattered Cover and read most of it from cover to cover just that afternoon. Then I bought the book, took it back to my sister's house with me, and I was just all determined that, I was going to sit down and do this mindful meditation and be transformed into this peaceful, happy individual. I remember pulling the pillows from my sister's bed and sitting on the floor for my very first meditation, thinking it was going to be all peaceful and blissful. And I was just shocked by the chaos and restlessness and anxiety in my mind. It was terribly uncomfortable. I hated it. And yet, I'm not exactly sure why. I really could, maybe just having that first glimpse of what was really going on in my mind and how much turmoil was inside of me. Maybe that's what allowed me to really stay motivated to pursue it. So when I did get to Durham, I found a teacher, a meditation teacher. His name's Jeff Brantley. I started working with him. He helped me find a meditation practice group that met weekly. So I joined that group. I started going on meditation retreats, multi-day meditation retreats. And, pretty quickly I could see this is really changing my life. And it's a path that I have stayed on consistently since then. So for the last, 26 years, it's been a major part of my life and the way I approach life. So, as I saw the way you could transform your suffering with these practices, and of course, my work is all about the transformation of suffering, I started integrating mindfulness, mindful awareness into my practice of psychiatry.
What areas transformed or got better after you started practicing mindfulness 23 years ago?
Well, the first thing, and so, it's interesting, as you begin a mindfulness practice, there are these sort of surface things that are vastly helpful and, start out as the most important things. And then as over time, as you go deeper, you experience other areas of growth that turn out to be even more important. But, the very first thing that happened to me is I felt less stressed out. I worried less. I learned this. I began to develop, which anyone can develop. It just takes practice. Most of us don't have much of it naturally. Some people do. But I began to develop this capacity of really holding my attention in the present, letting go of all my worries and plans about what might happen next, what was going to happen in the future, letting go of all my worries and regrets about did I make the right choice, what things I had said or done in the past. And as you begin to just really experience your moments, one moment at a time, one day at a time, paying careful attention to all these beautiful moments in your life that you often just ignore because they seem routine, then you very quickly get this diminishment of stress and this sense of greater well-being, and life just gets easier. And that happens quite quickly. So I think that was very obvious to me at first. And I think I was coming to the practice, like almost everybody I know, because I was in a period of suffering. And I think that's when people go to the trouble to put the time in to develop these capacities, because they're suffering. So I was just suffering less. And I loved that. And that was great. So I kept going. But then as you go along, you notice other transformations. So like I really became aware that I gossiped a lot, and I would, tease people in a way that was kind of mean. And I hadn't really noticed that about myself before. I didn't really think of myself as being that way. So I started just kind of changing the way I talked. Not like I need to change it, but it just kind of gradually changed. Like it wasn't kind of very satisfying to tease people. And gossiping about people just didn't seem very satisfying anymore. And, I became so much over time, much more compassionate towards myself and other people. Like you just get this sense of we're all the same. We all want the same thing. We all want to be happy. We're all trying to figure it out as best we can. And, we're all in this together. And this sense of connection to other humans, other beings, it's really transformative. Really, really you drop that constant judgment and criticism of yourself and other people, and you're living a different life.
Holly, why do you think people tease? I'm asking you because I was teased a lot in my teenage years.
Yeah. Isn't that an interesting question, Nishant? Why do we do that? Why do humans tease and bully and on a bigger scale, why are we aggressive and violent? Like, what is that? What purpose are we serving? I think it's all about social power when you look at teenagers and adolescents anyway. It's all about, I don't know if it's all about, that's probably an exaggeration. I'm sure it's more complex than that, but much of it is about social power, right? Having social status, getting approval from your peers, and unfortunately, accumulating social power for adolescents often involves denigrating, teasing, creating a hierarchy of power so that you're at the top, and that means pushing other people to the bottom, right? So my entire career in psychiatry has been in college mental health. So all my work has been with college students, graduate students, young adults. And it really has been my experience is that folks who went through a lot of bullying or teasing when they were in middle school or early high school, that it really is a pretty profound trauma that really impacts how they trust other people and create relationships as adults. It's really, it really has a terrible impact on them in my experience.
I can imagine that firsthand. When somebody's bullied, when somebody's teased so much in their middle school, their self-esteem, their confidence gets shattered.
Absolutely.
And I used to be one of them. My self-esteem, my confidence was nowhere when I was in middle school.
How did you transform that, Nishant? How did you?
So, well,
I'm going to interview you now.
The transformation did not happen to me. I was seeking for answers, and I was not fulfilled for first 29 years of my life. I'm 33 right now, and I had a very deep, painful moment or event, you can say, 3 to 4 years ago, and I was seeking something on YouTube, and somebody showed up, and from there, it creates a ripple effect. Confidence in one area of your life will spill into other areas of your life. And it's a practice. It's a daily practice. It's a daily work, inner work, and finding that everything is inside of you. If your inside is not content, the outer world will not be content. If inner work, or if your inner world is peaceful, you will find peace in the outer world. So whenever I get a chance to talk to the college students, I tell them to work on their confidence level, because from there it starts to create ripple effects. And teasing, bullying, when somebody is teasing and bullying, they are already going through a lot of trauma in their families. They're already going through so many things in their own lives. And that is why they are trying to be humorous. They are trying to gain social power.
Right.
They are already suffering. So if something is becoming too uncomfortable for somebody, you get to take action. You get to do something. And I used to be somebody when I did not retaliate. I did not stand for myself. I was kind of swallowing every shit.
Right.
Over to you, Holly.
Well, I do think that we all have to find, and hopefully people are able to find their way back to that sense of self-confidence and, understand. I do think it helps to understand that bullies are typically coming from a place of suffering, and they're very fragile, unhappy people, right? And like once you start to understand that, I think they lose some of their power, right? When you really start to understand that they are just like sort of animals in a trap that are biting every hand that comes near them.
How do you help college students develop mindfulness practices?
So that became one of my personal obsessions, Nishant. So I was working at the Duke Student Counseling Center and loved my job, loved working with college students. It was quickly apparent to me, I had not worked there for long, that so many of the students who were coming in with stress-related problems. And I knew that if they could develop this mindfulness practice, it would have a tremendously beneficial impact on them. At that time, I had already for several years been deeply involved in my own mindfulness practice. So I had experienced the transformation. I understood the power of it. And I could see how so much of their stress and worry was about how they were relating to the experience of being at a stressful, high-achieving institution like Duke. So I was like, all right, I'm just going to teach them all to meditate, and we're going to fix this, and we're going to not even need this counseling center because all these Duke students are going to be so blissed out. It's going to be awesome. But I immediately found it did not work that well because I couldn't get them interested in learning. They just I had not developed yet a skill for engaging them in the practice, for making them understand, feel motivated, feel interested in doing this. It just seemed like something that was kind of out there and, you want me to meditate? I'm not meditating. So I then kind of went on this long and interesting journey trying to figure out what's the best way to engage college students to help them start to experience these benefits so they'd be motivated to continue. And, when I started out, I would create these classes or groups, and I would have a hard time getting folks to sign up, but maybe I'd have a few sign up. And then by the next week, maybe half of them would come. And then by the week after that, maybe I'd have one person left. And, at the end of the year, maybe I'd trained one or two people in a meaningful amount of mindfulness practice. So eventually I got really curious about what is it that's not helping? What could possibly help? How would you offer this to people at this developmental stage, at this stage of life, in a way that would make it seem important and appealing to them? And as I was starting on trying to figure that out, there was a resident at Duke in the psychiatry program. Her name was Margaret Maytan. She also was interested in mindfulness. And she asked if she could come over to the counseling center and work with me and teach mindfulness to the college students because she knew I was doing that. And I said, you are welcome to come. I'm not doing a great job at it. I can't get a lot of people interested. But as we talked, we decided, well, let's just see if we can create a curriculum that actually works. So Margaret and I spent the next few years just trying to figure it out, okay, these are students, they're emerging adults. That's the name of the developmental stage that college students are in, emerging adulthood. We can talk about that in a minute. It's a fascinating stage of life. But, so what is going to work for this developmental stage? And we just decided to try stuff. So we tried different practices, different approaches. We tried different size groups. We tried sitting them in a circle versus putting them in lines. It was really interesting. And we finally came across this kind of recipe that just changed the game. And we went from nobody wanted to do it or nobody would stick with it to having huge waiting lists of people who wanted to be in our class. And the evaluations at the end of each class were things like, this changed my life. This is the best thing I've done at Duke. I'm going to be doing this forever. And that was just such a meaningful moment for me. So the curriculum that Margaret and I created, we named Koru, K-O-R-U. That's a New Zealand Maori word. It's the word they use for a fern plant, the spiral of a new fern plant. And it means looped or spiraled, but it also kind of references balanced growth or harmonious growth, which is exactly what emerging adults have the opportunity to develop as they develop these mindfulness practices. And Koru became really popular at Duke, and then folks in other places were wanting to learn to teach Koru. So we created the Center for Koru Mindfulness, and now we train people all over the world to teach this curriculum, Koru, to college and graduate students and other young adults, actually, emerging adults.
When I was introduced to Koru Mindfulness, to you, I thought your name is Koru. I didn't know that your name is Holly at the first moment. So Holly, I would love to ask you that. What recipe worked? What steps did you take from not working to working?
Well, there are so many different things. It's hard to know what is the most essential ingredient. But I will say, Nishant, that the way I learned meditation and the way most adults learn meditation is, you meet a teacher or you join a group, and there are these long periods of seated, silent meditation. And then the teachers talk about how it's going to be good for your blood pressure and, all these medical problems, or they talk about challenges that older adults have to deal with, relationship, work challenges, healthcare challenges. And that whole approach of long periods of sitting in silence, talking about things that aren't relevant to college students, no external accountability, like you just come when you feel like it, stay as long as you want. All of those things were not supportive of a practice for college students. So we found that you could not start them off with, all right, sit still and meditate. They just can't do that. They are restless individuals. Their minds are so busy. They're tortured by their busy minds. We found that if we required commitment, like, so when you start a Koru class, we tell you, okay, it's 4 weeks long. There's 75 minutes each class. You have to come to every class and you have to meditate for 10 minutes a day. Like, you have to commit to that. Otherwise, don't sign up. When we started saying that, our enrollment went up and people started sticking with it. It was so interesting. They're students, right? Like, they're used to people saying, okay, here's the expectation. Here's your homework. You have to do it. And then they would do it. The problem about learning these practices, you can read books, people can tell you about it, but if you don't actually practice it, you don't experience the benefit. But if you do practice it, it does not take long at all to experience the benefit. And then you're motivated to practice more. So we just created a really tight structure. And we teach 9 different mindfulness skills and meditations over the course of the 4 weeks in Koru, so that folks have a lot of choice about what is most helpful for them. And their daily meditation practice requirement is 10 minutes. Now, we have done research on Koru that shows that 10 minutes a day for 4 weeks is dramatically helpful for individuals. And that's not something I would have believed, because I was coming from a tradition where you need to meditate 45 minutes a day. So, like, the college students are really, really busy. They don't feel like they have time to do these things. So we were really trying to find the lowest effective dose. And we found that 4 weeks, 75-minute classes, 10 minutes a day of practice was the sweet spot. They end that 4 weeks, and the most common feedback they give us is, it should be longer. There should be more classes. I loved this. We should have more classes. But when we tried making it 5 weeks or 6 weeks, after the 4th week, nobody came. Like, the attrition was really high. So we figured out that leaving them wanting more was fabulous. And then we created another 4-week course. They could join another 4-week course. So
this is a great way to influence human behavior. And along the same lines, I read one book, Stick, How to Change Things When the Change is Hard. So it talks about that. How do you motivate human behavior? How to motivate yourself when the change is hard? So you shrink the change. Instead of doing meditation for 45 minutes, you are shrinking the change. You are just telling people, hey, you only have 10 minutes. And 10 minutes is achievable. It's not 45 minutes is big fat ass.
That's right.
10 minutes, you can do it. And personally, when I started meditation, I did it for 1 minute. And over the period of time, I increased the time.
Right. And it helped, right? Like,
yes.
even 1 minute of being non-judgmentally present can totally shift your experience, right?
Yes. Holly, I would love to ask you that, what's your meditation practice look like now?
So my meditation practice now is a little bit quirky because I meditate every morning in my treehouse. So, yeah, I have a treehouse in my backyard. I have a daughter who's a first-year college student, and in the pandemic is a terrible time to be a first-year college student, but that's a whole nother story. But when she was a baby, particularly when she was a toddler, trying to meditate in the house with her was just not possible. She was always finding me and climbing all over me and talking to me. I have like some really dear memories of, her like getting in my lap and then getting up and getting back in my lap while I'm trying to meditate. I remember one time I was sitting in meditation and I could feel like this something on my face. And I opened my eyes and my 2-year-old daughter was like standing, nose to nose with me. And she goes, "Done yet?" So I was like, okay, I got to get out of the house if I'm really going to meditate. So I just, out of necessity, we have a tree house in our backyard. I was like, all right, I'm going to the tree house to meditate, and started keeping my cushions out there. And then that just became my tradition. And I still am meditating in the tree house. So, depending on the day, I'll sit for 20 to 45 minutes. One thing that has really helped me with my practice, I find that I stay motivated if I'm kind of reading something interesting or inspirational. So I keep books in the treehouse, and I might just read a page or two at a time and reflect on it. And then I have my meditation practice in the treehouse, which I love, being outside and with the birds. And yeah, and of course, stuff happens. I don't make it out there every single day, but most days, that's how I start my day.
What are some of the books that have inspired you the most?
Well, I always go back to Mindfulness in Plain English, because that was definitely what started me off. And I actually just recently reread that with my Sangha, my sitting group. And that's such a great book. I really recommend that to everybody. What I'm reading right this minute is actually, it's a book by Oren J. Sofer, Sofer. Mm-hmm. It's called Say What You Mean. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
I am loving that book. So it's about personal communication, but Oren is, his primary, I don't know if it's his primary, but he's a meditation teacher. He's like a very experienced, gifted meditation teacher. And so he's like bringing his wisdom of meditation and mindfulness and combining it with his experience of nonviolent communication. And I'm finding it to be just such a lovely, it really gives me a lot to think about. So I'm enjoying that. I'm reading that right now.
Have you taught meditation or mindfulness to your daughter?
Yes, not very successfully. So our family participated so I live in Durham, North Carolina, and there's a meditation community for families. It used to be called, they changed the name since we left, so I'm kind of trying to remember what the name is now. It used to be called Buddhist Families of Durham, but then it became Family Meditation in Durham. But I was one of the Sunday school teachers for Buddhist Families of Durham when my daughter was in middle school, and she was in my class. I was the middle school meditation teacher. And it's really hard to teach middle schoolers to meditate. And one's child is particularly not interested in learning from their mother about meditation. But she grew up, we would go to meditation family camps. And once she got to high school, she was like, yeah, I'm not interested in that anymore, Mom. But I think she'll probably come back around to it now that she's in college. We'll see.
This is interesting. And I have asked this question to a lot of people on my podcast, that you teach meditation and mindfulness to the world. How do you influence your own family?
Right. Well, I tell you, Nishant, I think what is most influential everywhere we go is how we live our lives. Like what sort of person are we as we go through the world? And do we live with presence and compassion? And, that's really how we teach people, not so much by what we say or what we tell them to do.
Yep. Great. Holly, so since we have less time for this recording, I would love to ask you 2 more questions. So before I ask you my last question, I want to ask you, is there any quote that you live your life by, or anything that inspires you?
Well, we end our Koru trainings when we train teachers with a quote from the Buddha. And the reason we use it is just because I really like it. And I find it really inspirational. And that quote, hopefully this is not a terrible translation of it, but the quote is, the purpose of our practice, and that means, this meditation practice, the purpose of our practice is to abandon ill will and hatred and abide with a mind compassionate for the welfare of all living beings. And, I just love that ideal. And I just think about if we could all abandon ill will and hatred and live with compassion for the welfare of everybody, this would be a very different world. So I think in my work with Koru, we talk about wanting to transform the world by transforming the experience of young adults everywhere. And that's really what we're talking about, this transformation towards eliminating ill will and hatred. So that's what comes to mind for me.
And last but not the least, where can our listeners learn more about you?
So if you are a 20-something, and probably even if you're not, I have a book called The Mindful 20-something that is really a guide to learning mindfulness for folks in that stage of life. So if you really are kind of thinking maybe you'd be interested, but you're not sure, you might want to read The Mindful 20-something and just see. And I will say people who aren't in their 20s have said that is kind of a useful introduction, but really trying to bring my experience of how do you make it useful for people who are new to it in a busy time of life? How do you make it real and useful? So there's the Mindful 20-something. The Center for Koru Mindfulness, we both train teachers to teach Koru, and then we also have resources for 20-somethings to learn mindfulness. If you go to our website, which is korumindfulness.org, that's KORU mindfulness.org, you can find out all about our teacher training program, and you can also find links to guided meditations and other resources. We have a mobile app that is awesome for learning meditation. It links you to a self-guided meditation class. So you get the app and sort of a self-guided class. Or if you're taking a Koru class from a Koru teacher, you use the app, and your teacher will be mentoring and coaching you through your app the whole time. So that's a really cool bit of high-tech meditation that we offer. So korumindfulness.org is the way to access a lot of these things.
Thank you so much, Holly. It was wonderful talking to you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Nishant. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode today. If you did enjoy this, please subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, or you can visit https://nishantgarg.me, NISHANTGARG.me. You can also share this episode with your loved ones to help them live a fulfilled life. You are not alone in this journey. We all struggle in life. There is no shame in talking about it. I go through my highs and lows. I get depressed, and these practices help me in living a resilient life. You can also do this. You got this. Don't judge yourself. You are doing the best you can. And thank you so much again.